Hi, Jack Spirko here with the next video in the Permaculture series. Today we're actually going to do the 7 layers of the forest system. I was going to save this for later, but I think that I want to get some certain things into the mind of the audience early on so you can start seeing the interrelationships and the way that the principles we'll be talking about, the design principles we started on yesterday, will play out. So here's my plan. Today we're going to do forest system, 7 layers. Then tomorrow I'm going to talk about this same system and how it would apply in an annual garden or in miniature. Then the next one I'm going to do is some basic earthworks. I'm going to go deeper into what swales are and some other earthworks on large scale. And then the next one, the fourth one in this little mini-series in the series, will be on how you scale that down into your own gardens. And that way it'll keep the videos from being 20 minutes long like they were yesterday, and maybe I'll hold your attention better, and I'll actually be able to upload from my iPhone. Alright, so the other thing I got from you guys is you didn't like that the camera followed me all around. Well, look. Camera doesn't follow me. I do think that was a distraction. It's a new tool I'm using, this swivel thing, so we've killed that off. I don't think we need that for a whiteboard, but it might be cool for some other things we'll be doing in the future. Alright, so let's start out with the 7 layers of the forest system and what they actually are. And they are the canopy layer, the subcanopy, the shrub, the herb layer, or we also call this the herbaceous layer, the vine layer, or the climbers is another way to think of that, the ground cover layer, and the rhizome layer, which is a root layer. I've already drawn my crappy trees. Again, no comments about my terrible drawing to get a start out here. But here is, let's say, 2 mature trees in a forest stand. We're just looking at a little piece of it, so there'd be some back there and all, but there's a gap in between them. What happens when there's a gap in a forest? Some other stuff starts growing. One of the things that will begin to grow are other trees. And eventually we'll end up with a tree in here, reaching for the light. It's not quite as big as its other trees because it started at a different time. Alright? I got my colored markers for you guys to help things stand out more too. So we got a tree. And that is our subcanopy because this is our canopy. So this tree will sit down here and it'll occupy this space, right? And if one of these other trees eventually dies out, it'll sort of accelerate its growth at that point and come in and become part of the canopy layer. But some trees will actually stay this size like for in perpetuity. They actually have evolved to occupy this space. This is what they do. They either find little spaces to grow in like this, or they'll grow out moving toward the edge as we go out from transitioning from field to forest. They'll be more out there. But there's plenty of trees like this. Pawpaw is an example of a tree that'll grow like this. But then there's more space. So what nature abhors above all things is a vacuum. So then the next thing that might happen is we might start having some little shrub-like plants pop up here, right? So we've got some shrubs coming up. And they'll never be as big as even the subcanopy layer because they just don't grow that big. They grow much smaller. So we've got some shrubs growing in between. But there's still more space. So again, nature being nature, we'll start putting up maybe some herbaceous plants right in amongst everything. It'll start to fill everything in. Okay. So now I've got 3 of my 7 primary forest layers, and there are more than 7. We can have palm layers, emergent palm layers, all kinds of things we can start to see, but there's 7 primary ones. So now I've got 3 of them filled up. And this is what's important to understand. You need to understand these spaces because these spaces exist in a great big forest and they exist in a little bitty garden. And the basic rule is if you don't put something in this space, nature will. And what's going to go there, if you don't put it there, it's likely to be something you're going to call a weed. The weeds grow because you didn't put anything in there to occupy space. So what other space do we have left? Well, we also have a climbing layer. So we might have something like muscadine grape. Let's see, we use black for that. Muscadine grape starts growing here. And it wraps around this tree and goes all the way up in here. It's got leaves, especially up here. It has to get up high, right? It might be shaded out by this tree, but it'll get up high up here. And it'll put its own little leaves on, its own little solar collection system. And we'll get all fancy now, right? Then it'll grow grapes, little clumps of grapes. We have a fruit yield, because this might be a nut tree, so we have a nut yield. Right, so it's got its little grapes growing up there in the tree. But we might get a smaller leguminous species, or a smaller climber, like, let's say, groundnut. So groundnut starts climbing up here, and it kind of climbs up and climbs into this shrub layer. All right, so it's also a climber, but a groundnut is a legume, and so one thing it'll be doing to have this root system down here. Let's come off with a different color for the root system. So its roots are extending. You know, really we need to see that all these plants have roots. We'll talk about why that's important here in a minute. So everybody's got roots. All right? But this little legume has the roots like we talked about yesterday, and it's got its little roots, and see that more is coming out than going down in the ground. And along the pathway of this root system are these nodules. And with this particular species groundnut, some of them will get as big as your fist. Most of the time you're looking at little bitty ones in the first year, and then they'll get up to about the size of like a small hen's egg. And they're almost like kind of cross between a potato and a nut. They're very good to eat. So they have those, and that is our rhizome, or our root yield, and our root layer. There's space below here for more than just typical roots. There's a space here for tubers and things that can be productive and either edible by people or edible by animals. So that's there. But then this little guy here, since it's a legume, is also doing that little magical nitrogen thing. And it's fixing nitrogen into the ground, which is shared by all these roots. Now, there's still space left. I mean, there could be more vines and bushes and trees. You don't need to see my crappy drawing, but right along here, ground covers will come in. And then the ground cover, understand that the ground nut can be part of both the climbing and the ground layer. It'll do both. But there's all types of creeping, climbing layers that come in here, and they provide mulch. They also have their own root systems. Now, this occupies all the space. So if we plant something like this, not only are we mimicking nature, but we're going to have very little problem with competing species we don't want. We call those weeds. But understand, there's a place for weeds. They're very reparative. We'll get to that in a future episode. But this is the 7-layered system. And of course, you know, they continue on with more trees. One very important thing to understand in all this is how this system's functioning go beyond just the layers themselves. One of the things we have happen is we have a constant leaf fall. So these leaves are falling off of these trees in cycles, off bushes, off shrubs. Herbs are dying, and we're constantly building up a layer of humus and natural mulch. And in this system, the elevation's actually going to grow over time. Joel Salatin, great guy, that's done such a good job of building topsoil in his pastures. They had to raise the fence posts because they built the topsoil up to the point where the fences weren't high enough anymore. It took a couple decades, but it happened. The forest is doing the same thing here. The topsoil is being built by the forest over time. In a fungal breakdown, we have a bacterial breakdown in pastures. In a forest, we have primarily a fungal breakdown. Because in a pasture situation, a field, a prairie, most of the breakdown is being done of grasses and herbaceous plants by animals, ruminants that eat them and crap it out. In a forest, there's some of that going on, but more, we have all this huge amount of biomass dropping, and it's being broken down by fungi in the forest, and that's why these roots are important. The roots of this tree and the roots of this shrub will likely make connections under the ground, and here, and here, and here, and this is all interconnected. And even where there's not a direct connection, fungi are not the mushrooms. Fungi are the mycorrhizal layer. So there's this whole fungal web down here. And we'll see little mushrooms pop up, right? But the fungi is in the soil, it's in the leaf litter, it's everywhere. And it acts like a little highway system. In fact, if we were to take 1 cubic meter, so a little bit more than a cubic yard of soil, 1 cubic yard of good forest soil, 500 kilometers of fungal hyphae. That's somewhere around 240, 230 miles of hyphae. And that means the little net, all interconnected, if you stretched it all out and strung it together, this little tiny string, it'd be 500 kilometers long. That's much life's in the soil of a forest. And it's this system that creates that life. So as we're planting our forests, our food forests, our forage forests, our fuel forests, we need to be mimicking this. And there's a lot of ways we can do that, and we can create kind of a designer forest system if we want to, and we'll be talking about that more in the future as well. But I just wanted you to get the basic understanding of that the space is here and the space exists, because here's an objection that I had from a guy I like a lot named Jason Akers, the selfsufficientgardener.com. He said, what if I don't want 7 layers? You have 7 layers whether you plant them or not, because the layers are about the space that's available, and the plants will occupy the space. Tomorrow we'll actually talk about how this concept applies to annual gardening, even perennial gardening on a much smaller scale, and what we can learn about polyculture from it.